Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the PetroNerds podcast. My name is Trisha Curtis. I am the CEO of PetroNerds, and I am very pleased today to be joined by a guest. And this guest is very special. I saw her speak at the SPE conference in Tennessee a couple weeks ago, and was extremely impressed, not just by her speaking, but all the many questions that she asked, which was actually more than I did, which is very impressive. This is episode. Today is September 3rd, 2021. This is episode 27. And today we are honored to have Yoshi Pradhan, the senior reservoir engineer at Endeavor Energy Services. And I'm pretty sure I botched her name. She also has a full name. I'm going to let her introduce herself and give us a little bit of background on her. And then I know that folks are probably very interested in Endeavor because Endeavor is a private company, but we have a lot of different things we're going to touch base on this podcast. Endeavor is just sort of one of them. So Yoshi, without further ado.
Thank you so much, Trisha. I do want to make a slight adjustment. It's Endeavor Energy Resources. Endeavor Energy Services is another facet of our company too, but I just want to make sure that this is a corporate one. So I work for Endeavor Energy Resources. As Trisha mentioned, I work as a senior reservoir engineer. I've been there for about 3 years. For my past lives, I worked for an organization called University Lands. So for those of you who may not know University Lands, it's about 2.1 million acres, and 1.4 million of them are leased out to about 280 operators. And there's about billions of dollars worth of revenues that goes to the UT and Texas A&M systems. So I worked as a reservoir or production engineer there. And I also worked for Devon Energy as a production engineer out in Midland, Texas. Graduated from the University of Texas in 2015 with my bachelor's in petroleum engineering. May or may not be the reason why I'm wearing my burnt orange. And then I got my master's at Texas A&M University in 2020 in petroleum engineering as well. That's a little bit about myself.
That's awesome. No, that's great. And I saw that on your LinkedIn profile. But to the audience, at this SPE technical workshop, this was on unconventional completions, and I believe it was unconventional completions, and really it was on wellbore simulation and the spacing of wells. And it was we're going to I wanted to have Yoshi on the podcast so we could sort of recap this to a degree, because there was a lot talked about, and it is very technical. In some of the stuff I understood to a significant degree, and other stuff is very, very much in the weeds. And I'm not an engineer by training, so I was probably the only non-engineer, I'm guessing, in that room of folks. But it was a very good workshop, and Yoshi just sort of crushed it. And she asked extremely good questions and was just on the mark on every speaker, and had excellent questions. And then she actually closed it and was like the last speaker on the last day, and did an excellent job. So I was extremely impressed and was very eager to have her on the podcast. So, and really fortunate that she agreed to actually join the podcast.
Well, I really appreciated all the comments. There's been a lot of great content that was covered in the SP workshop that we're probably going to talk about more today. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation.
Yeah, so I think firstly, and I did say, I think I had Endeavor Energy Services on the brain because when I was flipping through the website, I realized that there is a services side, and my brain just stuck on so Endeavor Energy Resources. And just to give an overview, I mean, you guys have 350,000 net acres in the Permian Basin. You're basically just east of Odessa, north and south of Odessa. And you have 4 major counties, and you have 11 rigs running right now. So you guys are very active right now, and you've been ramping up activity and increasing basically since the bottom of the trough in July of last year.
That is correct. So we actually call it our Core 6 in our website. There's about 6 counties that we operate very actively in, that we're very focused on in terms of development. And we do have a lot of rigs running. We're also very much a growing company. So you may see on our LinkedIn webpage or LinkedIn site that we're always looking for people to join our talented team. As far as the activity, so that's just giving you some insight onto, if you want to join our team, go for it. We do have openings that are available. As far as the activity goes, we're definitely ramping up in activity. We're definitely trying new things in terms of how we can optimize our development and how we can really make the most out of what we have in our area.
Yeah. Well, I did see that you had job posting on your website. I'm always looking for some perfect part-time role for chief economist. I didn't see that pop up, but when that does, I'll be sure to apply. You guys did have an interesting posting. You had there's a completion engineer, so that's the job postings. I know that Digital Wildcatters has been putting out information on companies that have job postings. So I definitely would recommend, and I always recommend private companies. And actually, just meeting Yoshi, I would say it's worth a shot because, and you guys are private and you're a growing company. And, I have talked about on the podcast before about this, the bifurcation and differences in the business in terms of public and private operators. And truthfully, I think that you have an immense amount of flexibility as a private company. I mean, it's not that we're going to get into the weeds on anything proprietary and talking about your completion designs or anything, but I think just in general, as private companies, given the regulatory burdens and given just the everything that's happened over the course really of 2020 and 2021, as a private company, you just have a lot more flexibility in terms of how you respond to prices and how you move around activity. And also, I think hugely potential regulatory concerns for SEC filings and everything. It's just not something that's there for a private company. And therefore, you guys are able to focus, as I'm saying you guys in particular, but private companies in general are able to focus more on operations. And I think we see that coming out in the data when you see the splits. In the rig count isn't yet dominated in the Permian by privates, but it's getting there. And I would say when you do look at completions and well starts, it is coming. Those well starts are looking pretty tight with private operators and public operators, and to me that's saying a lot. And that's saying the momentum shift toward private operators, which also is big in terms of the shift in how service companies and stuff work with you. And you guys seem to have your own service entities, so that's a very cool thing and makes it probably work well with your company. But it just is from a market dynamic, I think it's very fascinating, and I don't think that trend is going away anytime soon.
I really appreciate all that. Yes, we are growing. We're vertically integrated. And as you've mentioned, we've been very fortunate to have a very nimble team and a very talented team that's worked extremely hard to get the results that we're seeing today that you probably see in the public data. So it's a very hardworking team. We've put in a lot of work to get to where we are today with the rising production, with rising activity.
And are you, let's say, what's roughly your barrels per day and gas per day for production? Do you have a rough number?
We've reached a record number. You've probably seen it. We've reached our record number of like above 100,000 already. So
okay, that's what I thought. Yep. Yeah. So yeah, a decent amount of production. And this is the thing is that these are. I mean, so if you're pulling all these private operators and you're looking at these production increases, which is I think that I think EIA and other entities are starting to show what their estimates are because the data lags for production, and it's definitely creeping back up to Permian production in general is growing, and we're seeing that. So all super awesome and exciting stuff. And the fact that you guys have integrated services probably means that you can. Do you guys use the services that you list on your website? You guys use them in part of your operations, correct?
We use them as part of our operations as well.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that's very cool. Very, very cool. So, okay, so I think we should switch gears a little bit now that we know that what the date is, and that this SBE conference or workshop took place like 2 weeks ago. It was in Franklin, Tennessee, so it was way far away for both Yoshi and myself. Everybody had to get on a plane and go to this place, and I learned because someone did comment. I was like, "Why is this in Tennessee?" And somebody did comment that the reason that they like having these away from places like Denver or Houston is because that if you don't, people, it's like it's a 3-day conference that people will end up not showing up one day. They'll just stay in the office because their boss told them to work. I don't know how true that is, but it did seem that everybody was there and everybody was participating for 3 and 2.5 full days, which I thought was quite a bit.
I agree. We maxed out about 80 attendees for that conference, which was really nice, especially it's a good size for networking, but everybody was there for all 3 days. It didn't seem like anybody skipped any day, and people were all engaged. It was a very engaging workshop, and I strongly suggest that for those of you who are interested in attending those workshops, they're nice destinations. I mean, got to hang out in Nashville for a little bit, so that was great.
Yeah.
And it gets you away from the workplace for a little bit, but it's not just the vacation, but it's also a great learning experience too.
Yeah, I love it because it's a different way for me to learn, and you can only consuming. I know you referenced some SPE papers, and I want to get into some of those because those are definitely public, and we can talk about those. So what's cool is especially a lot of private companies and a lot of public companies do put out these, SPE, which is Society for Petroleum Engineers, these papers, and then they're often referenced. And so this workshops, I would say I think they're better than a lot of these conferences because they're, like you said, they're more intimate. It's a smaller group. And this one in particular, I went to one in 2014, and it was a Bakken completions workshop, and that was in 2014 here in Denver, and it was excellent, and it was really heated in terms of the dialogue and the debate, and lots of talk about refracts, all the big companies in the Bakken, but it was completely different than what we had today. And I know what we had 2 weeks ago, and I know there was also one in which I wasn't able to attend. There was one in California 2 years ago, pre-COVID, which I was told was excellent. I'm not sure if you went to that or how this one compared, but the point is, I think that if you're looking to learn something a little outside the box, these workshops are excellent, and they're also, folks are really candid and kind. And to me, it's more important actually to spend time with the engineers and just the CEOs, because you get the same high level stuff from CEOs all the time that are telling you about the company, and it's the stuff about what the operations that I think is really valuable and important, and I think a lot of learnings from each other. But my big takeaways, or at least one of them, and I'd like you to sort of jump in and correct me. I'd love to know what just your thoughts on. I was going through my notes, before this call, but I would love to know what your thoughts are on the big takeaways, because I'm sure they're going to be far more nerdy and a little bit and more insightful. But I had a couple of big takeaways, and it was that extremely low cost diagnostics was just a big theme. So, fiber was certainly mentioned a lot, but it was interesting in how the use of fiber optics was mentioned. A lot of folks had papers in which they had ran fiber optics in a single well, or maybe a few wells, but largely it was tests on a single well. And then it was sort of like a lot of the commentary was, okay, we ran fiber optics on this well, and then we completed wells near it, and then we used this sort of as this test well to tell us all this information. And then basically there was a lot of admitting that we're not doing fiber anymore. Would you this drop-in fiber, which I didn't even know was a thing, which is cool, and I'm sure is much cheaper. But so there was sort of that of this, like, we use fiber once, we use the intel, helped us inform completions, how we do this. And then there was the use of pressure gauges. A lot of talking about pressure gauges. And I know from my time at working in operated, pressure gauges are really valuable, not super expensive. I also thought tracers were talked about almost by every single presentation, but not really illuminated upon. It wasn't like, hey, with the use of tracers and pressure gauges, we can do this. But it was sort of like, drop-in fiber, pressure gauges, and tracers seem to be extremely valuable tools that are relatively inexpensive. And that's what I thought was cool, because I thought that, there was a few Endeavor, you guys spoke, Great Western spoke, and there was a couple of the private companies that spoke. Was Atlas on the refracts in the Marcellus.
Yes.
And had really, really good presentations, really succinct, and really talked about and was very honest about, we're a private company, we don't have the same, we don't have these massive science budgets to do all this stuff. And so the testing, I thought, was done in a very sort of pragmatic way. And you guys seem to have a better nerdy, cooler spin on it to a degree. But those low cost diagnostics I just thought were awesome. And I think I'm probably missing, it was and I'm not sure the cost on that. I've noted the sealed wellbore pressure monitoring, that seemed to be a relatively, that seemed to be a little expensive in my opinion, because you're sealing that off. And then the use of vertical wells and the use of vertical testing, which I think is super underestimated. There was talks about defits, but not to the same degree. And for our listeners, I'm gonna have Yoshi break out some of these and talk about them. But a defit is basically is like a vertical with like a mini tip into your horizontal, and then you sort of like do a little test, and it gives you all kinds of different diagnostics. A lot of it's for pressure, a number of different things. But to me, it's a pretty inexpensive way to get a lot of data very quickly. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say you've been spot on with a lot of the takeaways that you had regarding the workshop. I mean, there were some great completion trends that were stated over time for the past 10 years and where we're leading towards in those completions. For instance, there's been a convergence of 2 to 3 mile laterals, 200 feet stage length, and then about 400,000 pounds of proppant per stage. There's also been talks of between primary and infill wells. That was a major component of the workshop too, of parent-child mitigation. I call them primary infill wells, just to be a little bit more neutral.
Yep.
Not all of them are technically bad in terms of not in terms of fracture-driven interactions, which is another term I want to talk about. That it's a more neutral term because every single time when you hear a frac hit or a frac bash, there's a negative connotation that comes with it. That will be a detriment to the well, and there is going to be something bad that happens to it when that is not necessarily the case. But aside from that, there have been talks on how to complete your infill wells after when you've completed a certain amount of wells in your section. What do you do to those new wells? How do you optimize the production of those new wells? How you can adjust the intensity of those completions on those wells, and then what kind of cluster efficiency can you assume on those particular wells? What kinds of fractures can you see from your DFITs, from the DFIT data that you talked about? And then what kind of responses do you get from crosswell strains from your fiber data? And then how does that relate to communication? How does that relate to cluster efficiency? How does that relate to how you pumped in your job? Those were some of the.
Can we pause for 1 second? So
yeah,
the only reason I want to say this because I don't think many listeners will know what like a near wellbore strain is. I think a lot of folks know simply, we know that we're putting more wells closer together. And we know this sort of the parent-child dynamics that people talk about is that you had an older parent well, you drilled that well. And then if you were, as you're, it's very complex to have, 300,000 acres or 500,000 acres or whatever is a million acres, and you're trying to delineate those assets. And so you hold the acreage as well. So you drill a well, and then you have to, the well's great. That's awesome. And if you're public, it gets really even harder because that well's good. And then you have to come back and you have to put more wells in there. And we know from over time, understanding that, this rock is awesome. Firstly, I'll just state that I never thought that, I know there is near wellbore interaction. Wells do communicate. We have reservoir communication, but it is something I believe, wholeheartedly believe can be mitigated. And about 2 years ago, everybody lost their minds in the Wall Street Journal and everywhere with these nice drawings and presentations of, oh my gosh, these public companies were lying to us and they didn't have as many wells as they said they did. And look at these wells, they don't perform the same. And there was a lot of mistakes in understanding that. And part of that, I think, was it was a lot of folks in Wall Street that really don't understand this stuff that, in the level that you do for sure. And don't appreciate that it's, literally they understand lateral lengths, proppant loadings. And then it's like, well, these wells get closer together and all of a sudden production declines a bit. And of course, there's a reality that, basic reality in a reservoir, if you put wells closer together, there's going to be some kind of pressure changes and there's going to be depletion and different things. But the fact that we didn't think that there was ways to mitigate that, and given that, how much oil we know is downhole, and that, the speed at which you're placing these wells next to each other is pretty huge. And I think it's really interesting that sort of talk has died away, because most of the wells we're doing today are infill wells to a degree. I mean, we're not spacing them all 400 feet apart and just jamming them together, but it's not as though they're 2 miles apart either. We're talking about, what on average, we heard at least this event, there were wells from 400 feet to 800 feet. I think that seemed to be sort of a range. 400 seemed to be obviously tighter. Certainly we've widened up, and a lot of folks are sort of in this 800-foot range, but I think there's a lot of folks that try to push this down closer to 600. I know EOG is a little more aggressive in some of their well spacing, but the point is, I think that, this is why I really want you to talk about your presentation and what you talked about, is because you get into it. And I may just have, if you can, I wouldn't say, just clarify some of the terms like these near,
Sure.
cross training, because over time I've learned this stuff, but like the stress shadowing and all this near wellbore stuff, a lot of folks don't understand. But basically, one of the big takeaways, and I think it was Ovintiv and Devin's presentations as well, of somebody had said, we don't work as much on sequencing as we should. And I kind of thought that's a relatively basic thing of, the sequencing of these. And I have a little bit of experience with a private operator. And I would say that, sequencing was something I cared a lot about in how we wanted the wells done as this one first, then this one, and knowing that the first one, if that's the impacts you're going to have as you move on. And especially if you have even if it's not your well, it's still a parent well, it's still drained. So if you're, drilling wells next to other wells, whether they're your wells or not, you have to take that into account. And I think the better understanding of that reservoir and those qualities, the better you can sort of mitigate or offset some of those massive, like, holy crap, I thought that was going to be 600 barrels per day and it turned out to 400 barrels per day. And it just seems to me, my takeaways from this event, especially your presentation, was that, it's not quite as bad. There are things to mitigate this. It's not like you can fix it completely, but a better understanding of the rock does help with this. So that was a lot. Yeah.
No, that's correct. As far as this, I'll break it down as far as the crosswell strain. When you break your rock and when you are putting some stress on the rock, you notice a strain on there. You notice a type of strain. That's what we're trying to capture. And that's what the crosswell strain definitely means. But you mentioned about sequencing that I wanted to go off of. That, yes, sequencing is really important because on how you break your rock or which well you fracture first, that will impact the fractures of the other well and the well that's above it, how you're zipper fracking. So yes, the sequencing is definitely important because you're affecting how those other wells are going to fracture, how those other wells are going to definitely perform. So that's something that I wanted to mention.
And not just the sequencing though, right? It's the actual, and you talk about this, and I'd love to, you can give us a sort of overview of that SPE paper and your presentation, but it's not just the sequencing, but it's how you're actually completing those, right? So it's, and this is where I think that, for the listeners of understanding those low cost diagnostics, if you're using pressure gauges, if you're using fiber, if you're using this stuff, some folks are using real-time monitoring to sort of change on the fly, right? And you actually mentioned, I think I put quote, change on the fly. And that was something I think a lot of folks don't necessarily do, especially public companies may actually be bigger companies that once they put money towards something, they may change, if they've got test wells that they're doing, they may change a little bit down the road to mitigate something or alter it if they've seen something in the data. But typically changing on the fly isn't something they want to do because they want to hold things constant. And I think if you're really trying to figure out how to best perform in a well pad, that changing on the fly makes sense in a way from an actual performance standpoint and what you're doing from a real-time data standpoint. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Sure. I talked about changing on the fly because the rock is going to break differently throughout the lateral, obviously, because of the stress shadowing that you talked about. What I ended up presenting was how to mitigate the fracture-driven interactions, or these frac hits that we keep calling it as a negative connotation, between a parent and a child. So a well that's already been completed versus a well that's about to be completed. How do you protect them to maximize production? So some of the things on the changing on the fly, there was a technology that I want to talk about, another low cost one. It's called Shear Frac. And they try to maximize the number of shear fractures that are throughout the reservoir, throughout your wellbore. By maximizing the shear fractures, you achieve that differently with different completions, which is why on-the-fly completions is something that I would suggest that you may want to consider, because the way the well is going to frack in the toe is going to be different on the way the well is going to frack at the heel. So you'd have to place your proppant, place your fluid, ramp up your proppant a little bit differently throughout the wellbore. But another reason on increasing those fractures is with the existing well that's produced, that well's already been producing and that well has changed the pressure. It's depleted. So for the shear fractures to happen, that's going to be a fun art. That's what I'll put it.
Can you define shear fractures and then how this technology helps with shear fractures?
Sure. So a shear fracture is pretty much a fracture that you can maximize your surface area. You're breaking the rock to where you are creating more surface area for oil to come out, or for hydrocarbons.
And maximizing the surface area is the goal of this. Well,
yes,
is excellently goal. I mean, not necessarily if you're wanting to create more near wellbore complexity and intensity, but still in an instance, you're still wanting to maximize that. You just don't necessarily want your fractures to go out as far.
Yes, so exactly. Okay. So the company differentiates shear versus tensile fractures. Shear fractures, more near wellbore, maximizing surface area. Tensile fractures are those pinpoint fractures that connect to the primary well or that parent well. and you want to reduce that communication between the parent well and the child well. That way you're not losing reserves for that child well. So with shear fracturing, or with the shear frac philosophy, you're trying to maximize that surface area throughout the wellbore. Because the wellbore responds differently from heel to toe, you're going to have to change your completion design a little bit, make some slight adjustments. The challenge with some of that is it's going to have to take some real-time monitoring on the parent well, and it's going to take some real-time monitoring on the child well too. So it's definitely a team effort in terms of execution between to maximize those shear fractures and doing the fracture on the fly.
What is the, I think the trickiness, and even with publics, it's that, or if somebody is on the outside, if you're a New York analyst and you're thinking about this, it's that, what is the, is it the low cost ways of the monitoring, right? I did, when I was going back through my notes, there was a couple things I had noted, and it was that, most people had done that fiber optic once, they weren't continuing with it because, one, it didn't translate necessarily into production data or production diagnostics. But it was that, it was the use of pressure gauges, and it was everybody, and a lot of microseismic. And even a few years ago, there wasn't quite I don't know if microseismic has dropped in cost significantly, and I assume it has. But folks seem to be like, yep, microseismic on everything. That was sort of a go. So what is the actual, when you say the date you're monitoring, that, what do you actually monitor, or what are you looking at, and what kind of monitoring systems are you using? Just the production and the pressure gauges, or are there other things that you can use as well that are a relatively low cost?
Those are really great questions. The things that we're monitoring are pressure responses. We're measuring pressure responses, particularly at the surface for the primary well. And if it's downhole, if you have a downhole gauge, that's even better. You're looking at the pressure responses. You're looking at reservoir communication between that parent well and between that child well. So those are the primary responses. Now, while pressure is one of the primary things that we're looking at, we're also looking at production responses too. If you see a spike in your water production for that parent well, or if you see a spike in production from that parent well, then that's a sign that there is communication going on between your parent well and your child well. And that's the importance of having those pressure gauges, because pressure gauges gives you a higher resolution between your parent well and your child well when analyzing the potential communication when you're trying to frac your child well.
And then actually seeing that, and then actually adjusting on the fly. So adjusting
Exactly.
accordingly. So if you see that, so maybe is the response then, and you don't have to get into the proprietary stuff of, adjusting cluster spacing. And I know we talked about this before we got on the call, but I do want to clarify for listeners, sort of, we hear a lot about, we know we know lateral lengths, we know roughly proppant per foot, we know fluid per foot, but we don't always know what the stage, and it's not publicly available. But I think for folks to understand stage spacing and cluster spacing and what's it, having, my nerdy brain is always thinking about what's it like 2,000 feet down hole. And I'm always struggling with, because even at these events, sometimes you've clarified it really well, that it isn't the same. The rock is not the same along a 2 mile long lateral. And holy crap, when I think about when it's 3 miles, when folks are doing these 3 mile long laterals now, like SM just did one, and I'm going, oh my goodness, there's no way that rock's the same across it. And yet you're completing it relatively the same. You're using the same complete, and so, getting different production results, or trying to figure out, which areas are giving us better production or less production. I still think we're very much sort of in the infancy there, in terms of really which areas are producing and which areas aren't, and how do we mitigate that. But you're adjusting, so you're sort of adjusting on the fly. It seems like you do that personally, and you guys are able to sort of adjust. But so the methods of adjusting are just altering your completions to a degree, that you're putting less in, you're putting more in. What exactly is that, to the degree that you can talk to? Obviously not, you don't get into anything proprietary.
So the more proactive way is adjusting your completion design at the very beginning, which you talked about was cluster spacing, stage spacing. That's the more proactive piece. The on the fly piece of what you can change, the things you can control are what exactly you're pumping. So you can control your rate. You can control your sand. You can control, you can not just your slurry, but you can control how much fluid. You can also control what kind of chemical you're trying to pump in order to reduce the communication between your parent and your child well. There's
and
so many.
The rate seems really, that was a thing, as I've always thought that, but the rate seems really important too. Is that
Yes.
two wells complete exactly the same way with two different rates that you're pumping in. And we're talking about the rates at which you're pumping your proppant and your fluid and whatever, it's not just a slick water. It could be high viscous, high HVFR that people talk about, high visc FR, it's basically adjusting that. And I also appreciate now more the differences in, the minor differences in tweaking the fluid according to what individuals think about the reservoir and according to how they think they should frack it with that sand. But I think it's that nuanced understanding and that better understanding of the rock and being able to adjust that. So it's like, well, if I'm have two wells, I'm completing exactly the same, but I'm pumping the fluids and the proppants at different rates. I'm going to get different results. Logically to me, it's probably going to frack the well differently downhole, or maybe not frack if it's a complete difference. Maybe not frack it well at all.
So you've probably heard a lot about extreme limited entry. You've probably heard a lot about perf friction, perf erosion. You've probably heard about a lot of those terms, and I'm not going to get too much into the weeds, but it's definitely a function of that, which is why rate is so important. You're breaking your rock differently. You are getting your rate out of those holes differently. It's going to impact how your well is going to perform, which is why, the rate is definitely important, and how you place your sand and your fluid in a tight rock is extremely important too, which is why I'm advocating for the on-the-fly completions, or I'm also advocating for really paying attention to how your wells how your offset well is responding to some of your completion designs. But you're absolutely right that rate is definitely very important, because that is how it's breaking your rock, or that's how you're creating those shear fractures, as I mentioned before, to maximize your surface area for production.
Yeah, no, that's a great great explanation. So can you, I think we probably covered your presentation to a degree, but do you want to talk about that SPE paper a little bit more and expand on your direct presentation just a little bit more before we loop back on this conference stuff?
Sure. So we talked about how to mitigate the parent and the child well. So the way that we did that was we did our first preloading experiment. We preloaded the parent well, so we pumped water into the parent well, and it was at a low rate. You pump water into the parent well at a really low rate, and the purpose of doing it is that you're repressurizing that well. You're repressurizing that well to reach that virgin reservoir pressure. It's creating a pressure barrier. That way, whenever you're fracking that child well, pressure is going to go to the path of least resistance. You are creating more resistance so that parent well is protected. And we were trying to measure the technical success between the parent well and the child well by looking at, when this was a common theme that was heard at the workshop as well, a volume to first response. So how much volume you're going to pump during your stage until you see a pressure response. We were able to see that in the initial shut-in pressure. So after your stage, what's that initial shut-in pressure look like? And then through the shear fractures, how much shear fractures were created in each stage in the child well. So those were the three primary diagnostics that we were looking at. And that's what the paper was covering. What we found is that from the preloading between the primary well between the parent well and the child well, we found that we maximized the number of shear fractures for the child well that was right next to the primary well, because we created that pressure barrier. The volume to first responses, especially for the first 40 stages, was extremely high, meaning that it took more volume to pump into your reservoir before you saw a response. That means there was a lag time in response. There wasn't that much communication between the parent and the child well. And then in your initial shut-in pressures, they were on a slight rise, which means that with the stress shadowing, we've probably heard about it. That means we contained the frac. That means the frac was contained. There was near wellbore complexity, and we can ensure really good production from that child well. So that was quantifying the technical success that came from that experiment. in the Midland Basin. So that was really the coverage of that paper. And we gave a history of what we've done before in terms of we've experienced those fracture-driven interactions in other pads. So we need to find a way to reduce those pressure responses.
And for all you engineers out there, you probably have access. So I know that I wrote down the number. It was SPE 194349. I have yet to go find. I'm going to read it and go through in detail, but that's published. What year did you guys publish that?
We published that in 2019. So that was the do nothing case. And the preloading paper is, and you can write this down as well, as SPE 199686.
I got to read.
And then the quantifying technical success is ERTEC 3114.
Okay, so for all you guys, now I know for me, because I have to pay for these papers on One Petro, but they're usually be like $9. So I usually go ahead and pay for them and nerd out with them, but they're great for things like this. But so you explain that, and I always like to take this back, and I do think the one caveat I would say to this workshop is that a lot of folks don't take it back enough to, and I'm not saying you or necessarily individual companies, but it's not always taken back to what's the impact on production. And I think you guys were, and actually it's something I got to say for the private companies. There was a trend and theme that it came back down to economics and production. With some of the publics, it was sort of these big tests, things, which are great, and they were doing to inform their wider programs. And I think it seemed to work. But we didn't hear necessarily, and this is how it impact production. And part of that's because they weren't allowed to disclose that, et cetera. But I think when you said your impact, you've seen the pressure responses, what you're doing, you're able to create, adjust that completion design to create more near wellbore complexity. And I think that's something, so that's a takeaway that, when I'm trying to explain to listeners in this podcast and in other podcasts, is really that, it's not that every child well is going to perform exactly as the parent well, or that your parent well isn't going to have some kind of, it's not as though it's not going to feel an impact or a hit. But it's to the degree, can you mitigate it? And overall, what does your production profile look like? And it sounds like to me, from that, if you're allowed to, you don't have to give the numbers, but you were able to protect the parent well, and you were able to get a, production that you're comfortable with on these child wells.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. The parent well was protected, especially in terms of its production. The child well was also protected because it came back just as good as new, or just as good as well as the parent well too. So we had some technical successes with that too, and we had production successes from that preloading experiment.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, and I think that's the the basics of just the dealing with the parent wells. So I think that's things that folks in New York and Wall Street analysts have to understand, is that it isn't as though you can't do nothing. You can't just keep fracking willy-nilly and everything's going to be fine. But there are low-cost mitigation strategies to address this. And truly, the other thing I was going to point out, and I'm curious as if you found this as a theme, but I definitely did, was that during the course of these 2.5 days, a lot of folks mentioned the time, like simply, we had 2020 and it was awful, and we had all this time to study this data. And so that's sort of what, I, cut my teeth on this unconventional shale revolution. And I know since basically 2008 till now. And we've had all these, peaks and troughs. In 2014, people thought the sky was falling, but I was watching these operators, and the operators were really taking the time, and compared to now, it was nothing, but they were taking the time to really study what they knew and apply that down hole. And the same for this is that 2020, if you spent especially if you're a public company, and probably as private as well, but if you spent all that money on a test program, you sure as hell wanted to get something from it. You wanted to actually study and analyze that. So I think there was time to actually study it and analyze it and take something away from it. And everybody had nothing to do because they weren't drilling, completing wells, even though they probably should have been. But they did it. And they were, they took the time to study. And then really from the cost standpoint is that it was a push to say, did you take something away from this? And I think it pushed these operators to sort of, take those learns and apply them. And I would say that, when you're looking at production, you guys across the board, people, it's not like production looks like crap. Production looks pretty good. People are not, we're not seeing, massive diminishing marginal returns. To a degree, I think we see, you can look at, type curves for companies, in basic, in various data through Prism or whatever. You can look at type curves, and, sometimes they underperform a smidgen in years prior, but really they're in line with, overall the Permian Basin is really is holding steady. And that's very impressive to me when we're just considering how many of these wells are infill, and how many of these private operators. And I think a lot of pessimists, especially outside, analysts from the industry, really think, well, it just can't work. And I think this, listening to folks like you and this whole event, is that it can work. And it's, and I would say, I'd like your assessment, but how do you, there's probably more that you would like to do. There's probably, other low cost diagnostics and things you think you could probably tweak or fine tune, and I know that's not, in a perfect world, you don't have 5 wells to test all the time, but I imagine that there's fun things or tweaking that you would like to do that you think you could probably mitigate further.
Well, there's a great presentation that actually has not been published, but there's 3 types of mitigation strategies.
Hold on. Can you hold on 1 second? I'm just going to.
Sure.
Sorry. The puppy is just barking.
There was a presentation that that Devin gave actually 2 years ago, and it wasn't necessarily published, but they talk about 3 types of mitigation strategies, and you can find ways to mitigate those. You can find ways to mitigate. So there is the completion portion of it. You can take care of depletion, and you also can take care of, so there's a pressure component, there's a completion component, and then there's also like a reservoir component. So there's 3 ways to take care of mitigation strategies. And all these companies have definitely tools in their toolbox on what they want to do to mitigate the parent-child interactions. So as far as what kinds of tweaks that we wish we can do, I think we just have a lot of tools in our toolbox to just explore. And I think we as a company have done a really good job as far as exploring the data as well as the execution portion of it too. We try our best to analyze the data almost as immediately as we're trying to execute as well. So the completion portion of it is the proactive piece where you're doing your cluster spacing, where you're adjusting your cluster spacing, you're adjusting your stage spacing, you're adjusting your perf designs and everything. The depletion portion is what I mentioned, is through the preloading, whether if you want to do a small preload or whether if you want to do a large preload, which is the whole reservoir management portion of it too. So those are some of the things that I just wanted to mention as far as tweaks go. I think we're still in the exploration phase as far as what kinds of tools we want to get from our toolbox.
Yeah, and I would say, and I appreciate that explanation, and I think that something I think that folks don't realize is that it's you have your own set of engineers, right? You're an engineer for Endeavor, and you guys you have your way of doing things. You're not sharing. People are we have these workshops and stuff, but it's not like everybody's sharing exactly what they're doing. And there is a lot of, and I take this from a friend of mine at Liberty who had the quote, frack religion. Ben Popple at Liberty Oilfield Services we were discussing frack religion. And there is something, and I would say it goes to reservoir religion and, all kinds of things of how people see the rock. And I was thinking about, those, at this workshop, we had it was kind of cool. There was a little survey thing. There was an afternoon where we did these surveys, and oh my goodness, the variances of, just how people it was stage spacing, it was completion things, and the variances of what people decided and chose was across the board. And it really, my big takeaway was, holy crap, holy moly, this is the differences in opinion is so stark in just like literally stage spacing, or clusters per foot was pretty dramatic. And it's not that, there was definitely, a group of folks that, 70% or whatever that would agree on something, but you certainly had, another 30% that thought something completely different. And to me that, that's not a bad thing. That can be a really good thing, but not all this rock is the same. And even in the Permian, I think we're discussing this thinking about one, reservoir, but we have deeper complexities, especially like in the Delaware, when you really do have to be completing your, multiple layers of this rock together to be mitigating, this depletion and reservoir depletion and all kinds of things within the rock. So when you think about it and you think about all these numbers of operators doing this, there is no one secret sauce strategy. And so it's going to be, it's going to change across the board, and production results are going to change over time, and people have to learn. And it takes time, and it is an expensive business. I mean, we're talking, just a few years ago, these were on average at least $10 million a well. So that's how you're testing and learning, and it is expensive. But I would say, from a longevity standpoint of the Permian, those wells are not typically 10 million now. They're less than that. The laterals are longer, and the consistency and the production performance is pretty strong. And I would say not necessarily we're going to see massive changes in increased production out of these wells, but I think being able to tweak, is it 100 foot? Do we decrease that spacing 50 foot, 100 foot? Those modest tweaks can add up to quite a bit, or those modest changes in completion techniques and everything can add up to quite a bit. And I don't know if that's, necessarily for every single company, but I think over time, that's still something I feel like we're still very much in the early innings.
You're right. There's a lot of companies that are looking into those kinds of tweaks. I was going to mention Reveal Energy Services has done a lot of that work as well in trying to figure out your stage spacing, trying to figure out your cluster spacing, what kinds of tweaks you can make to improve the production or to improve the parent-child, to improve that parent-child mitigation too from a completions standpoint. So
yeah,
no, I'm in complete agreement with you on that.
Yeah. And I think overall for me, it's that, it's really because a lot of folks, and if you're thinking about how does Saudi Arabia look at this? I mean, truthfully, there's some folks within OPEC that need to listen to this podcast because I think that they probably, they don't appreciate how quickly things change. One of the other things I was going to mention, and I'll be getting into this, I'll be actually at Liberty Oilfield Services next week on September 9th, sitting down with Chris Wright at their event with the Denver Petroleum Club. So shout out to that. Register with the Denver Petroleum Club for this event. But it was interesting because one of the things that was surveyed at this workshop was what are the big things that are game changing? And I knew that it was going to be simulfracs, and everybody said simulfracs, that was going to be one of the biggest kind of step changes. And I thought that was really interesting because that's not like the super, that's not some technical little mitigation, cluster spacing or anything. It's literally, it's dual frac, it's fracking two wells at once, or to some form of fracking two wells at once. It's not just zipper fracking or simultaneous operations, but it is literally, depending on how many pressure pumps and stuff you have, simulfracking. And I thought that was a very impressive, that was of all the folks in the room and the engineers in the room, that was one of the answers. And I completely agree with it, but I do think it's something that the market is not appreciating. The overall market is not appreciating what that means. And not just for services and the intensity and the demand for sand and fluid water and everything, but it's just literally how many wells you can punch out. And I think from the data side, I'm kind of fascinated. If you're doing these wells at once, the types of data we're going to be pulling and thinking about and analyzing, it is going to, I assume it's going to help us inform a lot on if we weren't doing this before and we're doing this now, we're going to have more data and different data sets of how these wells are talking to each other, especially if we're fracking them, at the same time. And I think that could be, that's going to be an evolutionary thing that's going to be very cool to see that data and how that unfolds and how we're completing these wells two years from now.
Oh, I'm in agreement with you on that as well. I think especially with the kind of technology, one of the survey questions, the kind of technology that was asked was what kind of technology is going to make a breakthrough in the next few years. And you're right about simulfrac was one of those technologies. We're trying to be more creative with the goal of being cost conscious as companies go. We're trying to be more creative, not just from the downhole standpoint, but also operationally. So there's been definitely some great there's definitely been some great studies that have been done with simulfrac. I don't actually remember the paper, but there's a great Earth Tech paper that Chevron gave, and it's called the journey through simulfracs. So if you, I'll go ahead and send that over to you. But there's a paper that talks about how simulfracs was a success in the Permian by improving your transition times, by improving your costs, and by being able to reach the rates that you've been able to reach even with your traditional zipper fracking. So
yeah, no, that's awesome. And I did miss the ERTech event because I had a family reunion in near Mount Rushmore, so I missed that. But I heard that was pretty, and that was from this year, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's this simulfrac. It's very new, and it's not well understood. And even I was talking to my dad about it and my uncle who had worked as consultants with EOG several years ago. And I mean, I've been talking with other people, and it's not something it's not well understood. It's certainly not well appreciated. when we're looking at the frac spreads and we're saying, Primary Vision saying, 250 frac spreads or whatever it is, that number to me is not probably incredibly accurate, especially if you're trying to map that against the rig count, because the rig count's not even perfectly accurate anymore because you're just doing so much more with less. And I think the frac spreads are the same with that. All very good to me from the resiliency standpoint of the industry, especially the Permian and where it's going. And actually, we're seeing it across basins. And not to switch gears completely, I just want to hone in this one thing, because you mentioned the frac hits being positive in the beginning. And I think that there were at least two it wasn't necessarily there was a presentation by Great Western, which was awesome. The young woman there just did a fantastic job explaining what Great Western was doing here in the DJ. And, I'm going to try to get her on the podcast and talk about that as well. But the other one, the young woman from a lot of really great young women engineers that were killing it at this event. But from Alta Resources and it was really the positivity in essence of the frac hits, of refracking, these wells in the Marcellus. And that to me also from the refracking side, and I think I made some very public comments at this workshop of, there's a lot of longevity to this, these plays and these reservoirs that were, really not just because you guys may not be thinking about refracs right now, but it's something that's, all this data, all this stuff on cyber, all this data that you're accumulating will eventually inform that. And at some point, folks will be like, yes, we're going to go back to those reservoirs, whether it's refracking them or it's other form of enhanced oil recovery or CO2 or whatever it is. It's something in the back of a lot of folks' mind, and certainly probably in the back of public companies as well.
I agree about that as well. There are definitely some technologies that are mentioned right now, but we need to move at that pace, or it really is up to the company, depending on where they are in their inventory or where they are in their stages of development, to where they can start thinking about whether it's refracs, whether it's enhanced oil recovery, or the technologies that you mentioned. So it really is dependent on what stage the company's in with respect to their stage of development. But I agree that once the technology and the investment into the infill wells or these child wells are focused on, then people will start rethinking about the completions that they've done previously, and think about how can you optimize production on those particular completions. And the other thing is being proactively setting up your wells to where, in the event that you need to do those technologies, whether if it is EOR or whether if it is refracking, to make sure that you've set up your well bore, or you set up your completions to where you aren't going to hinder that. You're going to limit yourself to not doing any of those things.
Yeah, and I did think it was interesting, because I think about it from a super nerdy econ and business standpoint, is just that, some companies could be proactive enough to where, and I know, when it comes to SEC filings and reserves and everything, we're not quite there. And I thought the presentation at the end on refracs was there were certain things accurate about it and certain things not accurate. And I was clarifying to the group afterward that, just what you said just now, the where you're at in business, every operator is different. Every operator has an individual perspective. And, I study that on a different level, from, public trends, SEC filings, and operator earnings calls, down to the data of, what operators are actually doing and their differences. And there are a number of reasons why companies will prioritize things. They're different stages of their development. They have different management teams. They have, different holders that, that they're beholden to, number of different things. But the ability to sort of look forward and say, I know I'm not getting all the oil out now. And what are the low cost things I can do to sort of, whether or not I could sell this asset, refract it down somebody could refract, somebody could do CO2 flood, whatever it is. I think that's hasn't even been discussed, and is certainly something that, and I think it's game changing, because, folks abroad, and particularly, in OPEC, often talk about their reserves, and how much they have in the longevity. And they do have a lot. And they're actually going after unconventionals. And there's a lot of unconventionals in the Middle East. But I don't know if they appreciate the depth of the inventory really in the U.S. And that it is, the Permian is this gift that keeps on giving. And truthfully, the Bakken is the gift that keeps on giving. And where you found oil before, you find it again. And that's going to be no different here. It's like, well, we only got, we're in single digits for the percentages of what we're recovering. And certainly I think you'd probably agree, maybe you don't, that we're getting more out now, but there's probably a long way to go. Could you technically get more out? And I like to remind folks of, like, the old papers from, was it Lee Price from,
Yeah.
Williston Basin? Those were from the 70s that talked about the billions of barrels in the Bakken. And, I don't know if we're dissimilar from that now, of saying, we know we have a ton of oil down there. We're still not getting it all out. And it's not some newfangled gadget or gizmo that's going to get out. It's a better, and it could be cameras and different things, but it's a more intense, holistic understanding of the reservoir and the tweaks and the low cost tweaks to actually get more out. And that to me is, from a like blow your mind, a game changing standpoint. Together, I think that has a huge impact on the longevity of these oil plays.
I agree to that as well. The only thing I'm going to add to that is Permian Basin, whether if it's Midland or Delaware Basin, multi-stack, or it's a stack play, and the fact that there's so many billions of barrels of recoverables, to the fact that we have single percentages of recovery factors, means that there's a lot of work for us that needs to be done in terms of how do we get that production. What I'm saying is there's a lot of job security, especially in the unconventional space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a really great point, and I appreciate you doing that. Well, we're sort of coming up on this 55-minute mark. There are many things, and our listeners probably don't want to get into stage spacing and cluster spacing at this level. And I would love to. I'll probably ask to have you back on the other podcast, or maybe we'll do like a 20-minute nerd segment on just talking about completions. I might get some, and we could actually get some of these other engineers as well. But it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. You're extremely knowledgeable. Your company and your business really well. And I appreciate having you. And I will shout out and ask, I will poke you to ask your executives endeavor that I would love to, and I think you mentioned some of these guys have done other podcasts. To the extent that they'd be open, I'd love to have them on the podcast, and I'd love to talk shop. And if I'm in Midland, I'm going to invite myself to a field visit if you guys will have me.
Well, sure. I'll definitely talk to our executives in terms of their willingness to join you on the podcast. But definitely been a pleasure. It's been a great conversation, especially with the workshop and what we've done as a company.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And we'll talk to you soon. Bye.